On the night of October 1st, 1999, a 75-year-old man named Steve Beard sat on the patio of his mansion in Austin, Texas, sipping on a cocktail. And it was a great night. Warm evening, the leaves rustling in the trees all around his property, and behind his house there was this creek that was flowing along. And in the house, he could hear his wife Celeste washing the dishes. So Steve had met Celeste only about 6 years ago. It was actually shortly after his first wife, Elise, had died of cancer. And Steve had been with his first wife for 45 years, and they'd raised 3 kids together. And he'd just been totally lost after she had passed away. And really, after she had died, he had spent a lot of nights just sitting alone at the Austin Country Club, where actually Celeste had been working as a waitress. Celeste was only 30 years old at the time, which meant she was almost 40 years younger than Steve. But there had been an immediate spark between them, and they got married just over a year later. Now, some of Steve's friends and family had immediately assumed that, given this age gap, that Celeste was simply after Steve for his money. Steve, after all, had made a fortune as a business owner and a TV station executive, and he was worth about $10 million. But Steve knew that money could not possibly be the only thing Celeste saw in him. I mean, he knew that he took great care of Celeste, and also he took great care of her twin teenage daughters. I mean, he really helped give Celeste and her girls the stability that they desperately needed. However, despite that stability, one thing that Celeste had always struggled with for much of her life was depression. And in fact, earlier that year, it had gotten so bad that Celeste had actually tried to end her own life. And, she had failed, she'd lived, but as a result of that attempt, she'd spent a few weeks in a psychiatric hospital. Now, of course, that was a really traumatic and awful thing for the family, but from Steve's perspective, the upside of this was that Celeste was put on some new medication as a result of this hospital stay. She had made some good friends, actually, while she was at the hospital, and to Steve, it just seemed like, maybe now things were starting to maybe turn around for Celeste. And to Steve, the fact that Celeste appeared to be on the right path again was great timing, because recently, Steve had actually been dealing with health problems of his own. Twice in the past few months, Steve had passed out and actually had to be hospitalized himself. The doctors told him he had high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and he had some heart and kidney issues, but they actually couldn't quite figure out why he was fainting. They just knew he had, several symptoms going on. Now, Steve thought it was very likely stress-related, and he just needed to relax. So in fact, in 2 days from now, he was going to be taking Celeste on a 3-week vacation around Europe. After everything Celeste had been through that year, and also, Steve had been through as well with his own medical issues, he felt like they both could use some time away, just the two of them. But now, when Steve got up from his seat out on the patio of his home and he put the empty cocktail glass down on the table and he turned and he opened the glass door that led into the bedroom, he saw that even though he'd already packed his suitcase for this European trip, several days ago, Celeste's suitcase was still empty in the closet. And Steve couldn't help but feel like it seems like Celeste might be getting cold feet about this European vacation. Like she should have been packed already and she's clearly putting it off. So Steve left the bedroom and he went down the hallway and went into the kitchen where he found Celeste cleaning up. And when he got in there, as gently as he could, he told Celeste, hey, when you get a chance, you really ought to pack. And she told him, oh, don't worry about it. She'd just been busy all week. She'd get to it. Steve nodded, but wasn't really convinced that she actually intended to pack soon, but he said, okay. And then he looked over at the clock, and even though it was barely 9 p.m., he felt exhausted. So he told Celeste he was going to go to bed, and she told him that she actually intended to stay up for a bit longer. One of her daughters was having a sleepover at the family's lake house that night, and she said that she might go over there and just check on them later. Celeste told Steve that when she returned from doing that, she would sleep in a different room to avoid waking him up. Steve thanked her and gave her a kiss goodnight, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway, back into the bedroom. He got ready for bed, climbed into bed, and then he put on his oxygen mask because he had sleep apnea, and then he pulled the covers up, and he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, around 3 a.m., Steve woke up, and immediately he felt this horrible pain in his stomach. And even though it was dark in his room, he looked down, he's got the mask still on his face, and he could tell there was something on his stomach. And he reached down instinctively and he grabbed at his stomach and he felt something wet on his hands. And so in a panic, he ripped off his mask and he kind of sat up to look down at his abdomen. But as he did, just the pain he felt intensified so much just by trying to sit up that he fell back down And so he reached over and he clicked on the light and he looked down and there was blood all over his stomach, like all over the sheets everywhere. And so he begins screaming out for Celeste. And as he's screaming, like the pain is only getting worse and worse, and Celeste is not coming in the room. She's not even responding. And so as he's looking down, like completely panic-stricken, watching all this blood coming out of his gut, he has no idea how this is happening. He just reached over and grabbed the phone and he dialed 911. Just minutes later, a squad car from the Travis County Sheriff's Department pulled up outside of Steve's house with its lights flashing. Deputy Alan Howard climbed out of that car and he saw a fire captain and another pair of deputies on the front step pounding on the door. All Deputy Howard knew was that a man in this home had called in with some kind of medical emergency, but the dispatcher had not quite understood what was wrong with him. And so Howard just ran over to the front door, and there the other deputies told him that so far nobody was answering their knocks. Howard knew at this point, time is of the essence. They had to get in and make sure this person was okay, and so he didn't want to just sit out here and wait any longer. So he left the front porch and he went along the side of the house to see if there was maybe another door that was unlocked somewhere else. And so as Howard went around to the side of the property, the other deputies followed him, and then he eventually found this flight of stairs that went up to a patio attached to a bedroom. And so up Howard went, the deputies followed, they got up there, and they looked into the house and they saw a light was on. And then through the glass door, they could all see there was an elderly man laying in bed with a telephone receiver in one hand, and his other hand appeared to be just covered in blood. Howard walked up to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. So he pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and he broke the glass, reached in, unlocked it, and slid the door open. Then Howard ran into the bedroom, and when he got right next to the bed, he looked at this man who was still conscious, but he had a gaping hole in his stomach, like his intestines were literally spilling out. And that's why his other hand was so covered in blood. It was like he was trying to hold his intestines inside of himself. Howard asked the guy what happened, and the old man just said he had no idea. He'd just woken up and his guts were coming out. At this point, the fire captain came into the room, and while he knelt down with his first aid kit to try to bandage up this man's wounds, Howard began looking around the bedroom for any clue about what was going on here. And he noticed something that was round and yellow lying on the carpet. So he bent down to get a better look, and he saw that the round yellow thing was a shotgun shell. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious that this man has been shot in the stomach with a shotgun. But Howard's also realizing that whoever pulled the trigger might still be in the house. So at this point, Howard drew his own weapon, and he crept slowly out into the hallway. And as Howard began searching the rest of the house, he didn't find anybody. But what he did find is there were lots of other entry points into the home, lots of doors and windows. And eventually, when he found his way into the living room, he saw there was another set of sliding glass doors. And he walked right up to it and he found they were unlocked. Howard also saw that a table lamp in this living room was overturned, suggesting that somebody might have knocked it over while coming in or out of the house. And so Howard continued searching the living room, and then he found his way into the dining room, and then the kitchen, and then he went down a hallway into another wing of the house, and there he opened another door to a bedroom, and he found there was a woman inside, sleeping in her bed, totally sound asleep. At this point, Howard lowered the weapon, and he flipped on a light, and the woman immediately startled awake. And she was about to ask, what's going on here? But Howard just stopped her and he told her that he was with the sheriff's department and they were here responding to a 911 call. And he told her that the man in the other room was very badly injured and he had called 911. And so the woman, as she's processing what she's being told, she began sobbing hysterically and then just begged Howard not to let her husband die. And then a second later, in the midst of all this chaos, this teenage girl comes running in the room and goes right to the woman, and she grabs her the way a child would grab their mother, and they're sort of holding each other, and Deputy Howard, he's looking for potentially a shooter in the house. But just from the looks of it, it appeared very much like this is a woman who's very shocked, very shaken up by this. The girl, the teenager as well, appears equally shocked. But just to be sure, Howard asked this woman to identify herself, and through tears, she would say that her name was Celeste Beard, and that very likely the victim here, the person you're talking about, the man, is her husband, Stephen Beard. And then she also said that the teenage girl was her daughter. And so now, Howard, feeling pretty confident that these are just victims, he told them to just stay put, that he was going to search the rest of the house and just make sure that the house was safe. And so Howard, he leaves the room, he can still hear them crying behind him, and he searches the rest of the house. Huge house, but he searches every room. And there's nobody there. And so it appeared that whoever had shot Steve was gone. This is a paid partnership with ZocDoc. We spend a lot of time researching cases where things went wrong, where people ignored warning signs and told themselves everything was fine until it wasn't. Unfortunately, health can be similar. Most of us know we should go to the doctor more, but the process of finding one is its own ordeal. I've definitely put off appointments before, not because they weren't important, but because finding a doctor and checking insurance and getting something scheduled just felt like a bigger hassle than it should have been. ZocDoc is a free website that changes the way you find and book doctors. Search for local in-network providers, filter by insurance, read verified patient reviews, and see appointment openings all in one place. No phone calls, no hold music, just find someone, see availability, and book instantly online. 150,000 providers across 200 plus specialties in all 50 states. Appointments usually happen within 24 to 72 hours. Don't wait for a warning sign to become something worse. Your health matters. Head to ZocDoc.com/Mrballen or click the link in the description to book today. Thanks to ZocDoc for partnering with us. Around 5:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1999, so about 2.5 hours after Steve Beard called 911, Sergeant Paul Knight walked through the waiting room at a hospital in Austin, Texas. Knight was a criminal investigator for the Travis County Sheriff's Department, and he'd been called in to lead the investigation into this shooting. Knight stopped at the front desk and he spoke to a nurse, who told him that Steve Beard was in critical condition, so questioning him would not be possible right now. Sergeant Knight nodded and gave the nurse his card and asked them to give him a call if Steve's condition ever stabilized. As Knight turned to leave, he quickly scanned the waiting room, and he saw in the corner there was a deputy speaking to a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, as well as a teenage girl. The deputy waved to Knight and called him over, and so Knight went over and he introduced himself. The woman told Knight that she was Steve's wife, Celeste, and the girl was her daughter, Christina. And Knight, he said hello to them, but he knew that he had to do something that was going to come off as pretty insensitive, but he really had to do it as soon as possible. So after just, exchanging some pleasantries, he sat down and pulled out a gunpowder residue test kit. And then he asked Celeste and Christina if he could swab their hands before they began really getting into any sort of conversation here. And Celeste looked really surprised and asked if she was a suspect. And Knight explained that really at this point, everybody was a suspect. And so swabbing them for gunpowder would be the quickest way to rule them both out. So Celeste, who was still very clearly shaken up, she just put both her hands out, and Knight ran a test strip across both of them. And then after that, Christina put her hands out and he tested her hands as well. And then he waited for the test strips to develop. And about a minute later, he confirmed that they were both negative, meaning neither of them had fired a gun recently. And so with this test out of the way, Knight's entire demeanor sort of softened, and he asked Celeste to just walk him through what had happened that night. She told him that her husband, Steve, had gone to bed around 9 or 9:30, and shortly after that, she had left their home and driven over to the family's lake house to check on her other daughter, Jennifer, and her friends who were having a sleepover there. She said the lake house was about a half an hour away, and so by the time she finally came back after checking on Jennifer and the other girls, she said it was about midnight. And, she walked in the house and it was quiet, there was nothing unusual, and she said she went straight to bed. And she said she actually chose to sleep in a different room than Steve because Steve had gone to bed earlier and she had told him she didn't want to wake him up if she came home late. And so she was doing him a courtesy by sleeping in this other room. Knight asked Celeste if she knew anybody who might be mad at her husband or who might want to hurt him for any reason, and she said no. But she did say that the previous afternoon, her husband had gone out and cashed a really big check. He was going to give some cash to her twin daughters, while she and Steve were going to be in Europe. He wanted to give the kids some spending money while they were away, and it was quite a bit of money. And so she said, maybe somebody at the bank saw him cashing that check, knew he had a bunch of money on him. Maybe they followed him home to rob him. And so Knight and Celeste spoke for a little bit longer. And then when Knight was done questioning her, Celeste got up and said she was going to go outside and smoke a cigarette. And as she left, Knight turned to her daughter, Christina, and asked her about what she'd seen and heard from the previous night. Christina said she had been asleep all night until around 3:30 in the morning when she had woken up to police lights flashing outside her window. And as she continued to tell her story of what happened, Knight noticed that she was being really careful about what she was saying. Not like she was trying to remember some concocted story, but rather it was like she was literally trying her best to actually remember. Like she was struggling to remember just what amounted to a pretty traumatic and very, chaotic night. But before Knight could ask any more follow-up questions, another girl, another teenager, who looked exactly like Christina, ran into the waiting room, and immediately Christina got up to go over and hug her. And when the two girls pulled away from each other, Knight noticed that both of these girls were sobbing, and they really were just like identical. Christina introduced this new girl as her twin sister, Jennifer. And then just a few seconds after that, two teenage boys came through the hospital door, and they hurried over to join the group. And as they all sat down, Christina explained that the two boys were her and Jennifer's boyfriends. After Christina briefly updated her sister Jennifer and the two boyfriends about the condition of her stepfather, Knight turned to Jennifer and just asked her to please walk him through where she had been, the previous night. And Jennifer would say, she had been at the family's lake house, she was there with her boyfriend and one other friend, she'd been there all night. And then when they had found out something had happened to Steve, they had all rushed here as soon as they could. And so Knight, he asked the girls if either of them knew anyone who might want to harm their stepfather. And as soon as he asked that, Knight noticed the two teenage girls, they shared this quick, knowing look between themselves. At this point, Christina turned back to Knight and said there was only one person she could think of who would do something like this, a woman named Tracy Tarleton. She explained that Tracy was a friend of her mother's, and they'd met earlier that year at a psychiatric hospital where they had both been patients. But Christina said there was just something off about their friendship. Tracy seemed like really unstable, and Christina got the feeling that she was actually in love with their mom. And as soon as she said this, all four of the teens just sort of nodded knowingly, like this was something they definitely had talked about internally. And then they all began to agree out loud that Tracy very likely was the one who did this. And then a minute later, a fifth teenager came running into the hospital and they joined the group, and Jennifer introduced her as another friend. Her name was Amy Cozart, and she had been the other friend sleeping over at the lake house that night. And Amy, who literally had just joined and heard, no context to this point about anything the other teenagers had said, when she was asked pretty much right away by Knight if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Steve, she didn't hesitate. She just said, "Oh, Tracy Tarleton." Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Sergeant Knight knocked on the front door of Tracy Tarleton's very unassuming ranch-style house in a working-class part of Austin, Texas. While running a check on Tracy to confirm her address, he'd also discovered that she had a weapons permit for a 20-gauge shotgun, the same caliber as the casing that was found inside the crime scene. Tracy answered the door pretty much right away, as if she had been waiting for someone to come by. And Knight, after introducing himself, told her that Steve Beard had been shot. And when he said this, he didn't notice any shock on Tracy's face. Instead, Tracy actually looked scared. Knight asked Tracy if she had any idea who might have shot Steve. And she said no, but then she asked if she needed a lawyer. And Knight said, "Well, that's up to you." And then before she could really react to that, he asked her if he could come inside. And Tracy just sort of turned and led him into the living room. Knight walked in, he sat down, and he just continued talking to Tracy. And so he asked her about her relationship with Celeste. And she said that yes, they had met at a psychiatric hospital when they were both being treated earlier that year for suicide attempts. And then, sort of unannounced, she told the detective that at first, when she had met Celeste, her feelings towards Celeste had not been platonic. They had been romantic. She had been interested in Celeste as a partner. But she then quickly clarified and said that was in the past and that now they really were just friends. And so Knight took stock of this and didn't really ask too many follow-up questions on their relationship. And instead, he just said, "Okay, well, where were you the night before?" And Tracy said she had been here at her house the whole time. She said that she had ordered pizza and she'd had a few beers and then had just gone to bed. Knight asked her if she owned a gun, and Tracy said yes, but she only used it for skeet shooting. Knight asked if he could see her gun. And so Tracy got up and she walked over and opened up a closet and she pulled out a shotgun in a zippered case. Knight asked her if he could take her gun down to the ballistics department, and Tracy definitely hesitated for a moment, but then she was like, sure. Later that same day, Sergeant Knight walked through the crime scene at the Beard Mansion, looking for any clues that the investigators might have missed during the initial search. Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, had actually come with him to help point out anything that could be out of place that he wouldn't necessarily notice. Inside of Steve's bedroom, Knight saw that some of the drawers and closets had been left open, as if they had been ransacked by a burglar. But something about the whole scene just didn't seem right. The drawers, they didn't appear to have been ripped open as if somebody was in a rush. They had been pulled out really carefully, and inside the drawer, things were basically pretty neat. And so tonight, this didn't really appear to be a burglary. He suspected that someone might have staged the crime scene to appear to be a burglary to throw off the investigation. However, just for good measure, he asked the twin girls to look through all of these open drawers and closets to see if you can identify anything that was missing. And so the girls began looking around, and eventually Christina said that she couldn't find Stephen's watch or his sapphire ring. Now, on the one hand, this might give credit to the idea that this really was a burglary gone wrong, that Steve was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot by the burglar. But tonight, this development that these two small items were gone actually only seemed to confirm the idea that this was not a burglary gone wrong, because this whole house was chock full of nice jewelry and antiques. There's so many other things in the house that could have been taken that were obvious that were not taken. And so Knight, he left the bedroom, walked down the hallway, and went into the living room, and there he's looking around at all this obviously very expensive furniture and vases and paintings and all this stuff that's super valuable all over the place. He began to consider another possibility, that maybe somebody in the family had killed Steve for the inheritance. I mean, this guy clearly is loaded. Now, Knight didn't know what Steve's will said yet, but he knew that along with his two stepdaughters, he had 3 adult children from his first marriage, and all of them very likely stood to inherit millions of dollars when he died. And then there was Steve's wife, Celeste, who was less than half his age. It was hard not to wonder if she'd simply married him for his money. And so it wasn't really a far cry to wonder if maybe she had been involved in the shooting, because if he dies, maybe she'd get all of his money. And so as Knight was thinking about this and wandering back down the hallway, he noticed a trap door in the ceiling that led to an attic that he hadn't noticed before. So, curious, he reached up and pulled open the door, and then he climbed up the ladder that came down, and before long he was in the attic. And up in the attic, he saw there was a box lying on the floor just a few feet away, and, where everything else in the attic had been totally covered in dust and cobwebs, this box was not. It was perfectly clean, as if it had only been put up here pretty recently. So he grabbed the box and he opened the lid up, and inside was a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight knew this could be extremely important to this case, so he immediately packaged up the box, picked it up, and he carried it down the ladder back down to the main floor. And when he got down there, he saw one of the twin girls, Jennifer, staring at him looking really nervous. She rushed to explain that that shotgun she had purchased as an anniversary gift for her boyfriend, and she was just keeping it up there out of sight until it was time to give it to him. She swore the gun had never been fired, and she had not even taken it out of the box yet. Now, Knight heard what she said, but he held on to the box because he still was going to bring it back to the ballistics department right away to have it tested. I mean, it seemed very odd to him that Jennifer hadn't mentioned until now that there was a gun in the house, and that it just happened to be the exact same gun, same caliber, as the weapon that was used to shoot Steve. Now, Jennifer did have an alibi. She had been at the lake house at that sleepover 30 miles away on the night of Steve's shooting. But her sister, Christina, had been home the whole night, and Knight had to wonder if maybe the two sisters had plotted together to kill their stepfather, maybe for his money. After all, it just seemed weirdly convenient that Jennifer, Christina, their boyfriends, their other friend Amy, had all, without any hesitation, named Tracy Tarleton as the suspect. It just seemed like something here was not quite adding up. That evening, Detective Knight went back to the hospital, and the nurse at the front desk told him that Steve was out of surgery and was stable enough to finally have visitors. She gave him Steve's room number and then let him through. However, when he got down the hallway to Steve's room, he saw this handwritten sign taped to the door that said no law enforcement personnel allowed to interview patient except in the presence of his attorney. And as Knight was processing this pretty surprising sign, out of nowhere, Steve's wife, Celeste, came rushing down the hallway and literally blocked him from going into the room. She said that for one, she was not going to allow any further searches of her and Steve's house, and if police wanted to speak to her husband, they'd have to go through the family's lawyer. And Knight, he was stunned by this, because in all his years on the force, he had never seen a victim hire a defense attorney. And then more than that, Knight wasn't even sure if Steve was the one who made this decision. Steve was stable now, but he really had no idea if he was actually conscious. Was it Steve who decided to put up this roadblock? Or was it Celeste? So at this point, Knight really didn't know what he was legally allowed to do here. And so, using an abundance of caution, he just turned around and left, at least for now. And as he, walked out of the hospital, he tried to make sense of why Celeste was suddenly being so defensive. Even if she was not the one who made this decision, the way she had just treated him in the hallway was just very aggressive. And then he began to wonder if maybe she had heard about the gun that he had found in their attic and was now trying to just protect her daughters. Or maybe she was trying to protect herself. On the afternoon of October 7th, so 5 days after Steve Beard was shot, Sergeant Paul Knight looked through a folder of interview notes at his desk. By this point, he'd spoken to all three of Steve's own children, his adult children, but they were all ruled out as suspects because they all lived hours away and had solid alibis. When Knight had asked one of Steve's sons if he knew who might have done this, he had told the detective to look into Celeste. After all, pretty much they all thought she was in this marriage for money to begin with. But, Knight had tested Celeste for gunshot residue right after the shooting, so he knew she literally could not have been the one who pulled the trigger. And so at this point, to Knight, it just sort of felt like the entire family was just pointing fingers at each other. But at the same time, Knight did feel like at least one family member on some side of the family was likely involved in the shooting. There was just frankly too much money at stake here. In particular, it was definitely suspicious that Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, had a 20-gauge shotgun in the attic. And on top of that, that she and her twin sister Christina and all of their friends had immediately pointed the finger at Tracy Tarleton. And then as for Tracy, she did have a pretty weak alibi and she did own a 20-gauge shotgun. But despite that, she had absolutely no history of doing anything violent like this. And she was remarkably cooperative and had even handed over her shotgun for analysis without really any fight at all. And so at this point, Knight knew he really just needed to speak directly to Steve. But the family's attorney was preventing the police from seeing him. And Knight wasn't sure how stable his condition was, or really how much longer he would even be alive for. So this was a very tenuous situation. But just then, Knight noticed something out of the corner of his eye. And he looked up, and he saw there was another detective in the doorway of his office, just sort of leaning there with a big smile on their face. Knight asked them what was going on, and the detective walked over and handed him a manila folder. And he told him this was a forensics report they had just gotten back. A piece of evidence that had been found at the crime scene may have just cracked the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, confessions, and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Steve Beard in the early morning hours of October 2nd, 1999. Around 2:30 a.m., the killer turned off their headlights as they drove toward the Beard mansion. They parked at the back entrance to the property, far away from the house, so the noise of their engine wouldn't wake anybody up inside. They got out of the car, slung a shotgun over their shoulder, and began walking through the trees towards the mansion. And as the patio came into view, they stopped. They felt sick, and they actually didn't want to go through with this, but they had made a promise. They had to do it. So they swallowed their fear and continued walking towards the mansion. And when they got right to the steps that would lead up to the patio, they went to the right and they walked to a separate door that led into the living room. That glass door was unlocked, so they opened it up, they stepped inside, and then once inside, they navigated their way to the main bedroom. And when they went inside the main bedroom, they found Steve asleep in his bed. The killer walked to the foot of the bed and just stared at Steve for a second. And then when they were ready, they raised the shotgun in their shaking hands and they pulled the trigger. And the blast was deafening. Blood began pouring out of Steve's abdomen immediately. The killer reflexively racked the shotgun, ejecting the shotgun shell, getting ready to fire a second time if need be. But then, Steve, he began fumbling for the nightstand, like he was maybe reaching for a weapon of his own. And the killer, at this point, they're reaching down on the ground, trying to find the spent shotgun shell to take that with them. But they're so scared that Steve's about to shoot them. And so they just abandon the shotgun shell. And then with their shotgun, the killer runs out of the bedroom, down the hallway, back out through the living room, back out the same door they came in, knocking that lamp over in the process. They shut the doors behind them and ran to their car. And from there, they drove to a safe location where they washed their hands, they threw their clothes into the washer, and then they very thoroughly cleaned their shotgun. And then after it was pristine again, they put the shotgun back into storage. The killer was in fact Tracy Tarleton, Celeste's friend from the hospital, who all the kids had said she's the one who did this. Well, it was her. The shell that was found on Steve's floor came back from ballistics as an exact match for Tracy's shotgun. And so she was arrested on October 8th, less than a week after the shooting. And then after she was arrested, she confessed to the killing and said that ultimately she had killed Steve because she was in love with Celeste and she wanted Celeste all to herself. However, a few months later, in January of 2000, Steve actually died from his injuries. And after that, a new story began to emerge. It turned out that Tracy's love for Celeste was not one-sided. The two women had been having a full-blown affair for months before the murder. In fact, Celeste had begun secretly slipping Everclear into Steve's cocktails, which is more than twice as strong as the vodka that Steve thought he was drinking. And so basically, Celeste would get Steve really, really drunk and get him to pass out. And then once he would pass out, Celeste would go sneak off and spend the night with Tracy. According to Tracy, Celeste had asked her to kill Steve so they could be together. And so for the first few months after Tracy's arrest, Tracy kept her mouth shut about Celeste's involvement. But then 5 months after Steve died, Celeste got remarried to a man that she had just met. And that's when Tracy realized that Celeste was not really in love with her. She had been using her to get rid of Steve so she could inherit all his money. And so when this happened, Tracy was so hurt by what Celeste had done that she began telling the real truth with the authorities. And eventually, she agreed to testify against Celeste. And so based on Tracy's testimony, Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002. She was eventually found guilty of Steve's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tracy was also convicted of murder, but because of her cooperation, her sentence was reduced to just 20 years, and she was actually released on parole in 2011. Around 6:30 p.m. on December 10, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff sat inside of a guard shack at the Kennecott Copper Mine in northern Utah, reading a college textbook. The shack was barely big enough for one person to sit inside of, and there were windows on all four sides looking out into the total darkness. The sun was already down, and this was a really isolated part of the mine with no lights or other buildings nearby, so apart from a little bit of moonlight on the snow, it was basically pitch black outside. Brian had worked as a security guard for this mine for a little over a year, but he'd only been stationed at this particular guard shack for a couple of weeks now, and in his opinion, it was the worst post he could have been assigned to. His job was to guard this chain link gate on a remote service road that led into the canyons. This was a really out-of-the-way entrance into the mine, which meant that not a lot of vehicles came this way. So the job was basically just really boring. But it was also simultaneously very dangerous. The Kennecott Copper Mine was known as the richest hole on Earth because of the huge amount of valuable materials buried there, including obviously copper and gold and silver. And that made it a big target for thieves. In fact, in just the past few months, more than $150,000 worth of material and equipment had been stolen from the mine. So as a result, Brian was a little bit nervous about being out here in the middle of nowhere. Not only because it was, pitch black outside, but also he was unarmed and there were no security cameras. So if he did encounter thieves, he basically had to handle it by himself, armed with nothing more than a telephone to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been, routine so far, slow and uneventful. So Brian was now just sort of passing the time studying. He was in nursing school and his final exams were coming up in a few days, so he was just sort of poring over his textbooks and notes to prepare. While he studied, he took out his thermos full of soup that he had brought for dinner. And just as he began eating the soup, the phone on his desk rang. Now, Brian immediately did want to answer the phone because he knew very likely it was his wife, Jennifer. But at the same time, right now, things at home were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had also started working nights at the mine to help support the family while he went to nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, it was hard to make ends meet. And now Jennifer was pregnant again with their second child, which was going to make things even harder financially. And the pressure of juggling school and work and parenthood had been putting a big strain on their marriage. And about a month ago, Brian had sort of reached a breaking point, and he'd actually walked out on his family. He'd left a note for Jennifer saying he just needed time alone to think. And then he had driven to his work, he had turned in his security badge and told his boss he quit. Then he had left town, and he'd spent almost a week in Las Vegas. And eventually, he'd driven all the way out to San Francisco. But while he was there, having his time alone, he'd received word that his daughter was in the emergency room with pneumonia back home in Utah. And for Brian, it was like that was his wake-up call. He realized he could not live with himself if he truly abandoned his family. And so he drove right back to Utah to be with Jennifer and to be with his daughter, who would make a recovery. And, Jennifer, she would take Brian back, despite, him walking out on the family, at least for a short time. But her accepting him back into the fold did not sort of make them return to normal. In reality, after he returned, there just was this constant sense that there was tension hanging over their relationship because of what Brian had done, abandoning them. So now, in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath, and then he picked up the ringing phone, and for a few minutes, he just chatted on the phone, until he suddenly saw something out the window. A flash of headlights coming up the road towards his guard shack. And so at this point, Brian said he had to go, he hung up, and went right outside to meet the approaching vehicle. About an hour and a half later, so around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. The shack's lights were on, but he couldn't see anybody inside of it. And Todd found this pretty odd, because Brian wasn't supposed to leave his post under any circumstance. That was sort of like the main component to the job. You stay put. But making this even stranger was Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. And this shack is so far away from every other building that really there was no way for Brian to go anywhere without his car, especially not, in the freezing cold like it was that night. So where was Brian? And so Todd, who was definitely feeling a bit apprehensive at this point, he parked his car, he got out, and he walked into the shack. And when he got in there, it's a very small space, but Brian, was not in there, but there was a hat and a half-eaten dinner on the desk inside. And so at this point, Todd felt like, we have an issue. Like, I don't know where Brian is. Something seems off. So he picked up the phone inside the shack, and he called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig drove down a snowy desert road toward the Kennecott copper mine. Now, everybody knew this mine was a target for thieves. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had seemingly vanished into thin air in the middle of his shift, well, Detective Lassig went out right away to investigate, because the thought was, this could have been perpetrated by thieves. Maybe, Brian's been kidnapped or something. When Lassig pulled up to the mine's main entrance, there was another vehicle parked right in front, and it flashed its headlights at him. And then a man in a security guard's uniform rolled down the driver's side window and sort of waved Lassig over. And so Lassig pulled up next to this car, and the man in this other car told Lassig that he was Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had called in about the missing guard. Then after that, Todd started up his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so he did. He followed him off into the darkness, driving down this dark, winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennecott mine was 3 square miles wide, with rocky terrain and mountains on every side. So they were driving for a good 10 minutes before finally Lassig saw this light up ahead, which was the guard shack that Brian had been in. The two men pulled up near this shack and got out of their vehicles. And then Todd told Detective Lassig that this shack was where the guard, Brian Ruff, had last been stationed. And so Lassig, he turned on his flashlight and then aimed it at the ground right outside of the shack. But there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any footprints or tire tracks that might have helped them were now covered up. And so Lassig stepped inside of the shack. And at first glance, everything looked to be in order. There was no blood, nothing overturned, no sign of a struggle. But again, there was a hat, Brian's hat, and also Brian's half-eaten thermos of soup, his dinner, that was still just sitting on the desk, which was pretty conspicuous. And so Lassig is kind of taking the whole scene in, trying to make sense of what could have happened, coming up with maybe some theories here, looking for any clues of where to look next. And as he was doing that, the phone on the desk rang. And Detective Lassig just picked it up, and he asked who was calling. And the woman on the line sounded very surprised, and she said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to reach out to her husband, Brian Ruff. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband Brian had at some point this night left his post and now couldn't be found, and so he was literally looking for her husband. And so he asked Jennifer when was the last time she had spoken to Brian. And Jennifer, she was obviously taken aback by this news, but she said she had just spoken with her husband a couple hours ago. She said they were talking, and then suddenly Brian had to hang up because he said he saw a car coming up the road. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about this particular car that was approaching or, who was driving the car or anything. But Jennifer said no, he didn't say anything, just the car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was obviously disappointed that there wasn't more information here, but he still thanked Jennifer and told her, I promise I will be in touch with you as soon as I possibly can. I'm going to go out there and find your husband. Then he hung up the phone and he turned his attention back to the scene, the inside of this very small shack. But just a few seconds after he had put the phone down, the phone rang again. And so Lassig picked it up again, and once again, it was a woman saying she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And she was asking where Brian was, but as Lassig is listening, he's thinking, this woman doesn't sound anything like the woman I just spoke to literally a minute ago, who also said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And also, this second woman clearly doesn't have any recollection of the earlier conversation. Like, these are two different people who are both claiming to be Brian's wife, Jennifer. But obviously, there could only be one, so one of these women had to be lying, right? On a morning in mid-December of 1991, so just a few days after Brian Ruff's disappearance from his remote guard shack, and still he had not been found yet, Detective Manny Lassig sat down with a cup of coffee in the Ruff's dining room across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. The investigation had been moving slowly so far because, for the first few days, everyone had been hoping that Brian would just return on his own. But as the days passed and he still hadn't been heard from, that was looking less and less likely. By this point, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, claiming to be his wife, Jennifer. And he had quickly found out that one of those calls was actually from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number, which meant very likely that was the real Jennifer Ruff. But Lassig was still trying to figure out why another woman had called and impersonated her. And also, the timing of the calls was odd. It happened one right after the other. It was just a very strange coincidence. So now, as Lassig sat across from the real Jennifer Ruff, he started out by asking her where she had been on the night Brian disappeared. She told him she'd been at the hospital all night working, and then she gave Lassig names of some of her coworkers who could verify that. At this point, Lassig completely pivoted and just asked Jennifer point blank, "Is there any chance your husband could have been having an affair? Were there other women in his life? Was he acting secretive or just odd lately? Anything to indicate, that he was maybe unfaithful?" The reason Lassig asked, obviously, was because of the second woman who he knew had called and pretended to be Brian's wife. He had no idea if the real Jennifer knew, but certainly he did. And the real Jennifer, when she heard this question, she just sort of looked down and then she looked up and she said, "Yes, I am suspicious of that." She told Lassig that she and Brian had been having some real issues in their marriage lately, and in fact, just the previous month, Brian had sort of inexplicably, ran out on the family because he needed time alone, and he was gone and out of contact for that whole time until he just came back begging to be taken back. At this point, Lassig, when he heard that part, he sat back in his chair and wondered if he was just wasting his time on this case to begin with. Because if Brian had previously left and then eventually came back after being totally out of contact, well, what's to say he wasn't doing that right now? What if this was him again, sort of running off to be alone, and he would just turn back up again at some point? But Jennifer must have noticed that that's sort of where Lassig's mind was going, because she rushed to add in that, the last time when he ran out for that week, he had left a note for her and even told his boss that he was quitting. Like, there was some warning before he left. She sort of made it dramatic, but he definitely told people before he was going to be gone. In fact, she became insistent that really it was not like Brian to not give warning. Like for him to just vanish mid-shift like that, like he's done right now, that's not something Brian would do. He's got some faults, but that's not something he would do. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer where Brian had actually gone when he disappeared that first time. And Jennifer answered him by handing him a piece of mail from a nearby table. She explained that it was a credit card bill that had come in the mail that week, and it was addressed to Brian. And she explained that she was pretty confused when she got this, because she didn't even know Brian had a credit card. But he apparently did, and he used it while he was away to pay for hotels and meals and other expenses. And so Lassig, he pulled out the bill and began to look it over, and he saw that a lot of the charges were made in Las Vegas and San Francisco. And the amounts that were being charged to restaurants and for room service seemed a bit too large for just one person. He looked up from the bill back at Jennifer, and just from the expression on her face, he knew that they had both drawn the same conclusion. Brian, when he was away for that week, likely had not been alone. Jennifer then grabbed another piece of paper from the counter and gave that to Lassig. This was a phone bill for the family's landline, with a full list of every call that had been made and received in the past month. Jennifer said there were definitely some numbers on this list that she didn't recognize, and she thought maybe one of them could be this person that Brian had been traveling with. And as Lassig looked over this list, one of the phone numbers immediately stood out to him, because that woman who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared and pretended to be Jennifer, basically called right after the real Jennifer, that phone number that was used for the fake Jennifer was the number he was now seeing on this list. Later that same day, Lassig sat down in the living room of the house that was associated with that phone number. And sitting across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine where Brian worked. Now, at the moment, Dale wasn't home, but it wasn't really clear when he would get home, and Lassig was really anxious to interview Christy alone, so before her husband got back. So the instant they sat down, Lassig pretty much just cut to the chase. He told Christy that he was nearly positive she and Brian had been having an affair. And then before she could say anything, he pulled out that bill that Jennifer had given him and showed her all the evidence. Christy, when she saw this, for a second looked defiant, but then just broke down and admitted it was true. She said they'd been seeing each other for a while now, and in fact, the month before, they had run away together for about a week. But even though they had ultimately come back and they both went back to their respective families, she said that they had still been very much in touch. Christy said that was the reason she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, just to call and just be in touch with him. That was it. But she said when the person answered, and it was a voice that was unfamiliar, it was Detective Lassig, she said that sort of on instinct, she just began to lie and pretended to be Jennifer, Brian's real wife, just so, their affair would not come to light. But Christy made it very clear that she had not heard from Brian since he disappeared, and she had no clue what happened to him. At this point, Lassig sat back on the couch and just looked at Christy, kind of sizing her up. And he thought, she seemed pretty genuinely worried about Brian. And even though the call she had made to the guard shack was ultimately very suspicious and pretty bizarre, her explanation for it did make sense. But at this point, he was certainly not going to rule her out as a suspect quite yet. Also, Lassig knew that Christy's husband, Dale, was also now clearly a primary suspect. Because, if he had found out about this affair, he could have easily hurt Brian in retaliation. The following day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station where Dale was already seated and waiting for him. And the moment Lassig walked in, Dale immediately asked him if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And it seemed to him like Dale's disappointment was genuine, like he was worried about him. Lassig sat down and he asked Dale about how long he'd known Brian for. And Dale said they had met maybe about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they'd become pretty close friends. They'd even hung out together outside of work. At this point, Lassig, almost to catch Dale off guard, he pivoted sort of abruptly and just asked Dale point blank about his wife's affair. And Dale, when he heard that his wife was having an affair, seemed sort of stunned, and he said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. At this point, Lassig just explained to him what his wife had already told him. And Dale appeared genuinely upset. Like, the idea she was cheating on him was horrible, especially with someone he considered clearly to be a close friend. And so as Dale is sort of reacting to this really shocking news, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. And so Dale, who again is sort of like dealing with the shocking news he's just been told, for a moment he just was unable to answer. He ultimately composed himself and he said that actually his car had gotten stuck in the snow while he was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, almost an hour away from the mine. And in fact, he had even had to call a friend to come get him out of the snow. And then he gave Lassig the name of this friend so he could call and confirm it. After taking down this friend's name, Lassig told Dale that he really wanted him to take a polygraph test, and also they would have to search his car. And Dale agreed to both, with no hesitation. One morning, a few weeks later, Lassig walked across a parking lot toward an office building at the Kennecott mine. So far, Brian had still not turned up, and the search for him had been frustrating because none of the people Lassig had questioned so far had given him any useful information. Dale Bradley, along with his wife, Christy Bradley, had both taken polygraph tests, and both had passed. Lassig had also searched the red Mustang that Dale drove, but there was no evidence in it that linked Dale to Brian's disappearance. Plus, the friend who had helped Dale get his Mustang out of the snow had confirmed he had done that, so his alibi was solid. So at this point, Dale and Christy were sort of unofficially off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the fact that maybe Jennifer, the real Jennifer, so Brian's actual wife, maybe she was involved in her husband's disappearance, despite how, honestly she came across. Now, her coworkers had confirmed she had been at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she could have maybe been working with an accomplice or maybe hired somebody to kill Brian or something. But with no evidence against her and also no body, Brian has not been found here, all Lassig really had here was just a hunch that, maybe she was involved, but who knows. However, just a few days ago, Lassig had received a new lead that sent his investigation in a new direction. That was why he was here right now at the Kennecott mine to speak to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. So Lassig went inside the building and made his way down the hallway to Todd's office. And when Todd saw the detective, he jumped up and he very eagerly greeted him and said he would do whatever he had to do to try to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told Todd to sit back down. And then Lassig sat down as well, and then he pulled out a tape recorder and he hit record. And then he told Todd why he was there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metal and equipment from the mine and then selling it at pawn shops. In fact, the investigation had discovered that a whole ring of Kennecott employees were involved in these thefts. Todd sort of began to shift in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he was never involved in any of these thefts. And he said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he understood that, and that was not really why he was here. He said when he looked through the records of the investigation about these thefts, he'd found out that Brian had actually been the one who reported some of the thefts that were going on. So now Lassig wondered if maybe on the night of Brian's disappearance, he'd stopped one of his coworkers' vehicles and found stolen materials inside, and maybe they had killed him to keep him quiet. Todd sat back in his chair and looked sort of lost in thought for a moment, and then he admitted that, yeah, that could be possible. He then told Detective Lassig he could actually think of several places on the mine's property where maybe Brian's body was hidden by these, fellow employees if they did this. And then as an example, he suggested the gravel pile by the concentrator, which crushes the minerals and grinds them up. Todd explained that if Brian had been placed there, he would have very likely gotten sucked into the grinders and pulverized with all the other rocks. He'd basically be gone. Detective Lassig was surprised by how specific Todd was being. I mean, Todd had really come up with this theory very quickly. So, sensing that Todd might be a little suspicious here, he just let Todd keep going. And Todd did. He just kept spitting out all these theories about maybe what could have happened to Brian, including, at one point, he said maybe Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen down and completely covered him up. And he said if that had happened, if Brian had been hidden in a place like that, he would already be buried under several tons of rock at this point, and the police would never find him. On July 10th, 1993, so a year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig drove through a barren desert in Utah about 50 miles south of Kennecott Mine. There had been basically no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours scouring the mine with police dogs and helicopters, looking for any sign that Brian might have been killed or buried or hidden somewhere there. But so far, there was still no trace of Brian. Now, Lassig was confident that there had to have been foul play involved, but it was impossible to prove that when he didn't have a body or evidence that tied any of his suspects to the crime. For months, Lassig's team had looked into every single security guard at the Kennecott Mine, especially the ones who had been implicated in that theft ring, but they had ultimately verified that every guard on duty was at their post at the time Brian disappeared. And they'd collected alibis from everyone who was not scheduled to work that night. And so they had not been able to actually link any guards to Brian's disappearance, and that also included Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, who seemed, very eager to offer up these very specific theories. He too was not linked to Brian's disappearance. However, Todd was ultimately linked to that theft ring. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and Christy's husband, Dale, those two, they had alibis, they passed a lie detector test, and really had been ruled out much earlier on in the investigation, and nothing new had come up over the last year to change that, so they were still ruled out. And then as for Brian's wife, Jennifer, Lassig at one point thought maybe she was involved, maybe she had an accomplice or something. She certainly had the motive, to potentially harm her husband. Their marriage was on the rocks, he had clearly been having an affair and she was on to him. But she really had been at work at the time he disappeared, and there was no link from her to any potential accomplice, and so it went nowhere. She was ruled out too. So again, after more than a year, the case basically had gone cold. However, that particular morning, the investigation had been reinvigorated because a group of campers had called in and said they had found skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew this was obviously a long shot, but he was holding out hope that maybe it was Brian. So when he arrived at the location the campers had described, Lassig got out of his car and he walked a short distance across the barren ground to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer to the crime scene, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. The skeleton was clothed in a dust-covered dark blue jacket, and when Lassig crouched down to get a better look, he saw that it was clearly a security guard's uniform. Lassig put on some gloves and then searched the pockets of this jacket, and his fingers immediately landed on a wallet. And when he pulled it out and he looked inside, he found ID cards and credit cards with the name Brian Ruff. Now, at this point, it seemed fairly apparent that the body had to belong to Brian, but because the body was so decomposed, they would have to examine Brian's dental records to definitively ID him, which would take some time. So, while the crime scene techs carefully loaded the remains into a van, Lassig stayed at the scene with the canine unit that was searching for any other evidence nearby. And sure enough, just a few feet away from where the body had been, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells lying in the dirt. It looked like Brian, very likely, had been shot 5 times and then buried in this shallow grave. Then, just a few yards away from the shells, a police dog began barking, and an officer called Lassig over to look at what the dog had found. He walked over, and the officer held up a black work boot. and there was a pretty obvious bullet hole through the leather. And so Lassig figured the boot must have belonged to Brian. But other than this boot and Brian's actual body, 18 months of heat and, wind and sand and snow and rain out in this desert had basically erased any other traces of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig at this point felt very confident that he knew both where Brian was ultimately killed and how he was killed, because of this severe lack of forensic evidence, he was worried that he might not actually be any closer to figuring out who killed Brian. 12 years later, on April 30th, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office got a call from the Sheriff's Department in the next county over. Since the beginning of the year, Detective Park had been working full-time on solving various cold cases. The detective on the line told him that he was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases, specifically the murder of Brian Ruff. After speaking to this detective, Park hung up the phone and went right over to his filing cabinet and dug through until he found Brian's file. He sat down and began sorting through the decade-old papers, and he realized that there was a tiny piece of evidence the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized it was actually the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Brian Ruff on December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down a winding service road toward a very isolated part of Kennecott Mine. Up ahead, they saw a single light in the distance. It was coming from a small guard shack right next to a chain link gate. The killer pulled right up outside of the shack and parked their car and then got out. And then seconds later, Brian Ruff came out of the guard shack and waved hello. And the killer sort of waved back and walked over to Brian, and then as soon as they were close enough, the killer grabbed Brian, whipped him around, tied his hands behind his back, and then forced Brian, before he could do anything, into the back of the vehicle. At this point, the killer jumped into the driver's seat, did a U-turn, and sped out of the mine towards the desert. And as they were driving, the killer heard Brian screaming and kicking in the back, doing everything he could to try to escape. But the killer was unfazed. They stayed calm and just kept on driving for nearly an hour, all while Brian's acting crazy in back, until they eventually reached another very remote spot way out in the desert about 50 miles away. There, they pulled off the road and they stopped their vehicle right in this open, snow-covered patch of desert. They climbed out, they went to the back seat, and they opened the door up, and they grabbed Brian, who was still fighting and trying to escape, but he was pretty tired at this point, and the killer dragged Brian out. And as they dragged Brian out, Brian began pleading for mercy and promised that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone about this. But the killer just grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then forced him at gunpoint to dig his own grave. And then when Brian was done, the killer just raised their shotgun and shot Brian 5 times. And then after he was dead, they dropped his body into the grave he had literally dug himself. And then the killer got back into their vehicle, a red Mustang. But when the killer tried to leave, their vehicle, the Mustang, got stuck in the snow. And so they had to call a friend who did come out, who had no idea a murder has just been committed literally right over there. There's a body buried, right over there. They didn't know. They helped the killer get out of the snow, and off they drove. The killer was Dale Bradley, the co-worker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that he had been an hour away, his car was stuck in the snow on the night Brian disappeared, well, it was true. Except that wasn't an alibi. He was basically describing being at the crime scene and having another friend come and help him flee the crime scene. But the friend who absolutely said, "Yup, he was an hour away, I helped him get his car out of the snow," the friend had no idea. This is where a murder has just taken place. And so they told the truth. And Dale sort of acted like, "Yep, that's my alibi." And the police never checked. And so they didn't realize that that wasn't an alibi. It was basically a description of where the crime scene was. Additionally, Dale took a polygraph early on in the investigation, and he did pass it. So he really was dismissed as a suspect very early on. And so Dale and Christy had eventually gotten divorced, likely over the affair, and Dale had ultimately remarried. But when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered in 2005, the detective investigating that murder noticed that Dale had been sort of indirectly connected to now two people who had been murdered, Crystal and Brian. And he thought it was suspicious enough that he got in touch with Detective Park, the detective who was in charge of all these cold cases, and he told Park, hey, you ought to take a closer look at Dale in the Brian Ruff cold case murder. And so that prompted Detective Park to not just take a closer look at Dale, but really at the whole Brian Ruff case file. And when he did that, he noticed this really small piece of evidence that sort of went overlooked. And that piece of evidence was a tiny speck of red paint on the sole of that black work boot, which had been found near Brian's body out in the desert. And Park was eventually able to match that paint to the same paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was charged with Brian Ruff's murder on September 19, 2005. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping and was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for Crystal, Dale's second wife who was murdered, her case remains unsolved. On the evening of May 25, 2023, a student named Jung Yoo Jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea. Jung was hunched over with her head in a book, studying for a really important test that she had coming up. But the words on the page just kind of jumbled together and she couldn't focus. And, Jung just felt really frustrated because she knew she needed to consume this material and internalize it. But the way she was doing it clearly wasn't working. She really needed help. However, Jung had previously tried to find a tutor, to get help. But finding the right tutor had proven to be very challenging. So Jung had recently signed up for this mobile app that was supposed to connect high school students to tutors. And she had reached out to over 50 people, asking them if they could help her prepare for this really major exam in her 9th grade English class. But everyone she had spoken to either was not available or just wasn't a good fit. But on this night, as Jung stared down at her book, desperately trying to parse through the words on the page, she suddenly heard her phone buzz. And so Jung, who was sort of eager for a distraction here, she grabbed her phone and she saw there was a notification from that mobile app, the tutoring app. So Jung, she opened up the app and she read the message and she broke into a smile because the reply was from a potential tutor that she'd contacted earlier that day that she had been, sort of optimistic about. According to this tutor's profile, her name was Chae-eun. She was a 26-year-old college student and she spoke fluent English. And now, in her reply, Chae-eun told Jung that she would be more than happy to help her and was actually available to start as soon as the day after tomorrow. There was just one downside. Chae-eun tutored exclusively out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient for Jung to just get there. And then also she knew her grandfather would definitely worry about her traveling that far alone. But after having searched for a tutor for so long with no success, Jung just did not want to pass up this opportunity. So she immediately messaged back that she couldn't wait to get started. And then she and Chae-eun set up their first meeting. 2 days later, on the evening of May 27th, Jung walked up to the tutor's apartment complex. It had taken her almost an hour to get here on the bus. And she'd been lugging, this huge bag with her full of her study materials the whole time. She had brought along basically all of her stuff, just in case they actually got to studying today, which realistically Jung didn't know if they would. This is their first meeting. She didn't really know what to expect. But either way, Jung was glad to be here. This represented progress. So Jung, along with her big old bag, went up to the door with the apartment number that Chae-eun had given her, and she knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and Jung saw Chae-eun standing there with a big smile on her face, and she looked exactly like she did in her profile picture on the app. Chae-eun then introduced herself and shook Jung's hand and welcomed her inside. Jung walked in and had a quick look around, and she saw the apartment was pretty small. It was a studio apartment. There was a bed and a couch in the same main area, and there was a kitchen and bathroom sort of branching off from there. Just then, Jung heard Chae-eun shut the door, and then she walked right past Jung and she took a seat on the couch, and then she sort of beckoned Jung to come have a seat next to her and come chat. And so Jung, she smiled and she's got her bag and she walks over and she sits down next to Chae-eun, and the pair just start chatting. And, Cheon asks her to explain again, sort of like, what are your main goals here? What can I help you with? And Jung said, well, I have this big test coming up for my English class, and, I was hoping you could help me with that. And Cheon said, yeah, of course I can. I'm fluent in English. I've worked with many people on, similar testing material. So, this is going to be great. And so Jung, she's thrilled, and she says to her tutor, well, like, hey, I brought my stuff. Can we just start the lesson right now? And Cheon was sort of maybe taken a little bit aback. This is their first interaction. But she's like, okay, yeah, let me just get a drink of water first. And so Cheon, she wanders off into the kitchen and disappears to get her water. And Jung unzips her bag and begins fishing out her studying materials. A few hours later, a taxi driver was driving through the northern part of Busan, scanning the sidewalk for potential customers. And at some point, as he looked around, he eventually saw this woman, who appeared to be maybe in her 20s, standing outside of an apartment complex, Cheon's apartment complex. And this woman, she had this large, very heavy-looking black suitcase by her side, and she was waving to the cab driver, clearly trying to hail him down. So the driver pulled up alongside the curb, he rolled down his window, and he called out to her and asked where she needed to go. And the woman told him that she needed to go to the Nakdong River. And this immediately struck the driver as being a little weird, because the Nakdong River was in a very isolated area far outside the city. It was like a really odd place for a young woman to go alone, especially this late at night. But the driver also knew that he could charge the woman a pretty high fare for taking her all that way. So he said, okay. Then he popped the trunk of his cab and asked if she needed help with her suitcase. But she immediately said no, she had it. So the driver just shrugged, and he waited while this woman lugged this heavy suitcase to the back of his cab, and she hoisted it into the trunk, she shut the trunk, and then she climbed inside. And then the driver pulled away from the curb and started heading out of the city. And it was a long, quiet ride, but eventually he pulled up to the entry point for Nakdong River, which was basically a trailhead surrounded by bushes that led into this sort of semi-forested area. At this point, the driver parked, and the woman asked him how much she owed him, and he told her, and so she pulled out her money and she quickly paid him. And then, just out of habit, the driver asked the woman again if she needed help getting her suitcase out of the cab. But again, the woman very quickly said no, she didn't. She would handle it on her own, but thank you. So again, the driver just shrugged and popped the trunk. And then he waited as this woman got out and pulled the suitcase out of the back. Now, at this point, the driver knew, his job is done here. It's not his business what she's doing here. But, it's almost midnight, and he couldn't help but feel sort of concerned about dropping this woman off here, basically in the middle of nowhere so late at night. And he just wanted to make sure that she was okay. So instead of just driving away, he just continued to watch as she walked towards the trailhead. And as he watched her, he noticed that she was really struggling to move her suitcase. I mean, it looked like it was so heavy that she could barely drag it through the dirt. And it was at this point that the driver couldn't help but feel like something's off here. This is not typical behavior. Everything about this just feels weird. What's going on? So, because he had this sort of gut feeling that something was off with this lady, instead of just leaving altogether and continuing his night, he just drove a little ways away from where he dropped her off and then stopped. And he turned and he just watched the trailhead to see if the woman would come back out or if anybody else would show up. And so he just continued to watch, and nothing happened for a while. But after about 20 minutes, he saw some movement, and out of the woods comes this woman. And she still has this suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty, or whatever was really heavy inside of the suitcase has been removed, because she's moving the suitcase no problem, whereas before, she could barely get it through the dirt. And the driver, he couldn't help but think, what was in that suitcase? Because clearly, she has come here to dump it somewhere out in this very isolated part of this area. This just feels really bad. I don't even want to know what she's doing. Somebody needs to investigate this, though. This just feels wrong. And so he turned around, he started driving away, he pulled out his phone, and he called the police. A few minutes later, the woman with the suitcase stood at the trailhead, hoping that another taxi might pass by soon and she could hitch a ride home. And at some point, she saw headlights approaching in the darkness, and for a second, she felt really hopeful, and she waved her hand hey, I need a ride. But when the vehicle finally pulled up, she saw that it was not a taxi, it was a police cruiser. And this cruiser came to a stop right next to her, and then an officer stepped out of the car, and asked her what she was doing out here so late. And in a very calm voice, the young woman just said she had come out here to drop off some trash because the dumpster at her apartment complex was full. But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her. He was actually just staring at her big black suitcase. And he actually just asked her, "Can I see what's inside of that?" And this made the woman very nervous. But she also knew that the best thing she could do right now was just continue to stay calm and cooperate. So she nodded and said, "Sure, have a look." And so the officer walked up and he unzipped the suitcase and he flipped it open and he shined his flashlight inside. And it was empty, but it was covered in blood. Like the blood had soaked into the lining all across the inside of the suitcase. But the woman knew this was going to happen. I mean, she knew what was in there and she'd prepared for this. She told the officer that she was simply on her period and the blood he was seeing was nothing more than menstrual blood. But the look on the officer's face made it very clear that he did not believe anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yu Jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and documentaries, coming up with what she thought was a foolproof murder plan. And so after coming up with this plan, she posed as a 9th grader and hired a private tutor, Chae-eun. But when she went to Chae-eun's apartment, she wasn't carrying books in a backpack. She was carrying a knife inside of a suitcase. After Jung told Chae-eun that she wanted to start her lesson, Chae-eun got up, she went into the kitchen, she got some water, and when she came back, Jung had gotten out her knife, and she proceeded to stab Chae-eun to death. And then after that, she dismembered Chae-eun's body, put the pieces inside of that suitcase, and then Jung attempted to dispose of the body in the woods by the Nakdong River. But her foolproof plan did not work, because she was ultimately arrested before she even made it home that night. Jung Yu Jung was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the evening of January 31st, 2012, a 72-year-old retired high school teacher named Norm Johnson was playing the piano in his home in the tiny town of Madison, South Dakota, when his doorbell rang. And Norm was surprised. I mean, not because, just somebody had shown up at his house. I mean, the reality is getting unannounced visitors was not totally unusual in his household. But tonight in particular, it was odd, because the Madison High School basketball team had a big game that night, and pretty much the whole town was there cheering them on. Like, who isn't at the game ringing my doorbell right now? Who would that be? Now, usually Norm would be at the basketball game too. Not only had he coached several sports at the high school during the years he had taught there, but also he had grown up in Madison and he had gone to the high school and he had played on the football team and been on the track team. And, those had really been, in some ways, some of the best years of his life. And I mean, even now as an adult, he still had such strong feelings and such a strong affinity for Madison High. It was like a home away from home. But despite all that, Norm had chosen not to go to the game tonight because he had just had a long day of meetings for the local boards that he volunteered on, and just in general, he felt like he just needed some time home to relax. And so before he got up, Norm called out to his wife, Barb, who was in their kitchen, and he just asked, like, hey, do you have any idea who's at the door right now? And she yelled back, like, no, I have no idea. So Norm got up from the piano and went to the door to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw a very unassuming man with gray hair and a beard who was standing out on the doorstep. Norm didn't know who this guy was, which was also just kind of odd, because again, Madison is like a really small town. Pretty much everybody knew each other. But before Norm could ask him who he was or what he wanted, this guy asked Norm, "Are you Norm Johnson?" And Norm said, "Yeah." And then, without another word, the man raised a pistol he was holding and he fired. An hour later, Madison Police Sergeant Justin Meyer parked his car outside of a little brown house that was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Meyer had been totally shocked when the dispatcher had called him to tell him what had happened here, both because there hadn't been a murder in Madison in almost 100 years, and because Sergeant Meyer knew the victim, Norm Johnson. And so now, Meyer walked up to the house and stepped over a huge puddle of blood right inside the front door. And then he found Norm's wife, Barb, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I mean, she looked like she was clearly in shock. Around Barb on the walls were all these old photos of her and Norm. And some of these photos clearly dated back to the 1950s when they had been high school sweethearts. Norm had been the star running back on the football team, and Barb had been a cheerleader. Meyer took a deep breath, and then he walked over and sat down next to Barb, and he asked her what happened. And she just said she didn't know. She didn't understand. She said that Norm had just gone to answer the door, and then seconds later, she heard what sounded like 2 gunshots. And then, as Barb sort of choked back tears, she said that she had run over and she had found Norm lying on the floor with blood pouring out of his face. And through the doorway, she happened to see this gray-haired man that she didn't recognize calmly just walking away down their walkway towards his car, and then he just drove off. And Sergeant Meyer, when he heard this, I mean, he really couldn't believe it. I mean, in many ways, he was just as baffled as Barb was about how in the world something like that could have happened, especially in this town. Like, what Barb was describing sounded like a premeditated hit, like an assassination. But Meyer just couldn't imagine who would want to do that to Norm. Like, Norm was beloved by the whole community, and he had been for decades. And so eventually, Meyer left the house and began to speak to all the neighbors. But, as he discovered, pretty much none of them were home at the time of the shooting because they were all out at that basketball game. And then also Meyer discovered that nobody in the area had security cameras outside their houses. And so nobody had captured any images or video of the crime. Because after all, I mean, Madison was typically a very safe area. And so by the time Meyer went home for the night, he was already starting to worry that he might not be able to solve this. However, the very next morning, Meyer got a call from a tipster. And this tipster said that there actually was one person in the area who definitely had a problem with Norm. That was a 73-year-old man named Carl Erickson. And at first, when Meyer began asking some basic follow-up questions, he just couldn't understand how this Carl guy could even be a suspect. I mean, he lived over an hour away in a different town. He was like a retired insurance officer with no criminal record. Like, how in the world would he be the guy that's, assassinating Norm? That just didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection. And then also there was just the fact that as people, they couldn't have been more different. Like, they definitely would not have overlapped in society. You have Norm, who's like very outgoing and social and beloved, and you have Carl, who's totally a loner, keeps to himself, and for the most part was kind of rude and just people didn't really like him. So like, there's just no reason that these two would come together. But Meyer had very little to go on here, and so he needed to follow up on any lead he really got. So that evening, he brought Carl in for questioning. And very quickly he realized that actually, Norm and Carl do have one thing in common. It would turn out Carl and Norm had gone to the same high school. Carl had grown up in Madison before he moved away. And the past 50 years of both of their lives had largely been defined by who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school had been Norm's glory days, Carl had a very different experience. He had been an outcast who basically, at best, nobody really paid attention to. And so while Norm is like the star of the football team dating the cheerleader, Carl had actually served as the football team's student manager, who basically ran errands for the coach and assisted from the sidelines. Deep down, Carl was deeply jealous of Norm specifically. I mean, he was popular, he's this jock, he's got all the things that he wanted but really couldn't achieve. And then one fateful day in the locker room after a practice, someone had come up behind Carl and put a jockstrap on his head as a kind of awful prank. And, Carl was not totally sure who did it, but over time, he became convinced it was Norm. Now, over time, the people who were involved in that prank, the football players, they just kind of forgot about it. And in fact, many of them sort of forgot about Carl himself. But Carl never forgot the humiliation. He stewed about it for more than 50 years before his anger finally boiled over and he decided it was time to get his revenge. So, on January 31st, 2012, he drove to Norm's home and he shot him in the face. A few months later, Carl pled guilty to second-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. On the afternoon of August 10, 2011, Detective Inspector John Finch of the London Metropolitan Police walked through the courtyard of the Radisson Edwardian Hotel in London. This was a massive luxury hotel with more than 400 rooms. Finch navigated past the beautiful greenery and the koi ponds and the multiple restaurants until he found the door he was looking for, which was roped off by crime scene tape with a uniformed officer standing in front of it. Through the doorway, Finch could see there were forensic technicians taking photographs and putting down evidence markers. This was a section of the hotel where members of the staff lived in small apartments, and the police had been called here by hotel management because the bodies of 2 workers had been discovered inside, and a 3rd worker was missing. Finch had already been briefed on the basics. The 2 dead were a woman named Alice Adams, who was 20, and a man named Tibor Vass, who was also age 20. And they both had been at the same party in the apartment they were found in the night before. Tibor actually lived in this apartment, and it was actually his roommate, a 31-year-old man named Attila Ban, who was the missing 3rd worker. And this was basically all the police knew at this point. They didn't even have a theory yet on whether the missing Attila was another victim or the killer. They really just didn't know. And so now Finch greeted the officer who was at the door and introduced himself and showed his credentials, and then he ducked under the crime scene tape. And before long, he found himself standing in this small living room type area where the first victim, Alice, was lying in this massive pool of blood on the carpet. She was wearing a shirt, but no pants, but she did have underwear on, and she had a couch cushion that was placed over her face, and there were stab wounds all over her body. One of the forensics techs warned Finch to be careful where he stepped because there was so much blood all over the floor, they didn't want Finch to step in it. So very carefully, Finch moved around the outside of the room and made his way into the kitchenette, where another forensics tech was picking up items one by one and dusting them for fingerprints and then setting them back down exactly where they were. And among sort of all the items scattered about the kitchenette, Finch noticed there were lots of pill and alcohol bottles. And so now he began to formulate his first theory, that this party they had all been to the night before had gotten way out of hand, and Alice had been attacked in a sudden rage by somebody who very likely knew her. Her missing pants suggested a possible sexual element, and the sheer number of stab wounds on her body and the amount of blood spatter really did suggest the killer was in some sort of a frenzy. The cushion that was found over Alice's face suggested that after the killer had sort of calmed down after the murder, maybe they had felt guilty and couldn't bear to look at what they had done, and so they covered her up. To Finch, this basically felt like a substance-fueled crime of passion. However, when he stepped into the bedroom, the scene inside of there told a totally different story. On the bed was Tibor Vass, the second victim, and he was completely naked, and he had been very carefully posed in this strange position where he was on his back and his knees were bent. It was immediately obvious to Finch that Tibor had not been killed here on this bed. There was only a tiny bit of blood on the sheets, and Tibor's body itself was perfectly clean, like it had been washed, before being arranged on the mattress. And then when Finch walked over to get a better look at Tibor's body, He saw that the man's injuries were much neater than Alice's. Tibor only had 2 stab wounds, at least that Finch could see, and both of them were directly to his heart. So this was a very efficient murder. And so after a minute or two, Finch sort of backed up and just found himself feeling really confused, because even though he was in one crime scene, there are 2 victims, 1 crime, it almost felt like it was 2 totally different crimes. Like the murder that took place out there with Alice had been messy and very impulsive seeming, and possibly was because the murderer was, heavily intoxicated. And then this murder of Tibor, it seemed like it was committed by somebody who was much more methodical and potentially even sober. And so Finch couldn't help but wonder, how does this missing roommate, Attila Ban, fit into this picture? Because clearly, that's the piece that seems to be missing and likely would sort of answer all of his questions. And so at this point, what Finch decided he would do is he would go track down the other hotel workers who had been at this party the night before, to see if they knew where Attila was, or what happened to Attila, or why any of this happened. They were there, maybe they knew something. And so Finch, he turned around and he left the bedroom and he very carefully navigated back across the living room, being careful not to step in any blood. And then he left the apartment. And as he did, he sort of noticed something strange. But right now he knew the most important thing was going and speaking to those other workers to see what they knew. And so for now, he sort of forgot this strange element he thinks he's discovered, put it over here, and just said, I'll deal with that later. And off he went to go find the other workers. Over the next few hours, Finch spoke to a whole bunch of hotel workers, and they were able to tell him a lot about Alice, Tibor, and Attila. Basically, they were all good friends, they all worked together, and they were known for being very responsible and very hardworking. Alice apparently had only just begun working at the hotel a few weeks ago, and coworkers said that she and Tibor seemed to have some chemistry, but no one was sure whether their relationship went beyond a platonic friendship, because Alice actually did have a boyfriend. And Tibor's roommate, Attila, the one who was missing, was apparently a hotel manager. And recently he'd been named Employee of the Year, and everybody seemed to really love working with him. Finch also learned more about the party that Tibor and Attila had hosted in their apartment the night before, during which the murders, must have happened. And apparently it was really just a small gathering to celebrate Tibor getting into college, and the only people in attendance were Tibor, Attila, Alice, and then 2 other coworkers. Finch had interviewed those 2 other coworkers, and they would say that, during this party, this gathering, everybody had been drinking really heavily. But they insisted that it was a calm night without any conflicts or fights. And they both said that when they left the party, Alice and Tibor and Attila were all alive, awake, and totally fine. And so this information certainly seemed to suggest that Attila did it. I mean, he was the most obvious one that could have committed these murders. The 3 were left alone, 2 wind up dead, the 3rd is missing, Attila. But Attila, despite the fact he was missing, which did sort of make him very suspicious, beyond that, he was like this unbelievably sweet guy who had no problems with anyone. He was like the Employee of the Year. It just didn't track. Nobody thought Attila could have done this. Nobody. The fact that Alice had a boyfriend, but apparently was, getting close to Tibor and, sort of going beyond being just platonic, that was intriguing to Finch. Coworkers said Alice, flirted with Tibor a lot, and Finch thought it was definitely possible that maybe the boyfriend had come to the apartment and found Alice and Tibor together being sort of inappropriate and killed them out of jealousy. It felt like a very possible theory. However, that would explain why Alice's body was in the state it was in, but that theory would not explain why Tibor's body had been posed in such a bizarre way, or also what happened to Attila, where's Attila? Now, Finch knew that all day his team had been pulling surveillance video from around the hotel. So in the evening, around 7 p.m., he went back to the station to start combing through the footage. He wanted to get his eyes on every single person who entered and left the employee housing area on the night of the killings. The hotel really was covered in cameras, and odds were the killer would be somewhere on those tapes. But later that night, when Finch finally got to the end of all the footage he was given, he was baffled. So the surveillance video didn't actually show the doorway to Tibor and Attila's apartment. It just showed the area around the building that contained the apartment. So Finch could only see who entered and left the building, not the individual apartment. So that was a limitation. But he could see Tibor and Attila and Alice and those other two party guests enter the building before the party. And he could see those same two party guests leave hours later, at almost the exact time they had told him they left. There was no sign of Alice's boyfriend at all, which meant he very likely was not the killer. Otherwise, you'd see him somewhere on this tape and he just was not there. And so as disappointing as that was, it, made sense and it at least sort of progressed the case. But Finch is also thinking, like, the thing the footage also doesn't show is what happened to Attila. Where is Attila? On the morning of August 12th, so 2 days after the bodies were found, Detective Finch went back to the apartment, now with his team of detectives. Attila, at this point, was still missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that was actually why Finch was back here with his team. He wanted to take a second look around, not just the building and the apartment, but really the whole area. Because they had traced Attila's phone, and it was pinging off a cell tower right next to the hotel, as if he was still here. But, keep in mind, by this point, police have searched the whole grounds, including every room, all the closets, all the utility areas. They've looked everywhere on this property and they have not found a trace of him. But Finch thinks, what else can I do but just keep on looking? So now, Finch and his team greeted the officer who was still standing guard by the crime scene door, and the officer let Finch and the other investigators in. And pretty much the second Finch stepped back inside this apartment now for the second time, he knew something was off. Finch had been staring at crime scene photos for the past 2 days obsessively, and as a result, he really had a good feel for how this place had been left. Because remember, when they take photos and when they, dust for prints and all that, they try to leave the scene exactly the way it is because it's all evidence until, the case is solved. But as soon as he walked in, he saw there was a vodka bottle that clearly had been moved. And his first thought is are you kidding me? Is this us? Are one of our techs moving stuff and not putting it back? Are we tampering with our own evidence? Or worse, has somebody somehow broken in here and moved things around, without our own guards knowing about it? What's going on here? And at the same time, Finch is faced with this new reality here. One of the other investigators pointed to the bedroom door, which was closed. And he said that he'd been here when the forensics team had left, and he was positive they had left that door open. And so Finch is totally flabbergasted. He walks over to the door and he turns the doorknob and tries to open it, but clearly there is something blocking the door, somebody put something on the other side of the door to keep it from opening up all the way. And so at this point, Finch and the other guys began basically ramming on this door until finally they were able to push it open just enough that they could look inside. And when they did, they find the missing third person, Attila Ban. He's lying face down on the bed, he was naked, and he was covered in blood. It would turn out the murders did take place during that party. The killer was there with Alice, Tibor, and Attila. And the killer, at some point during this party, after those other two guests had left, they saw Alice and Tibor kissing. And it drove them mad with jealousy. And they grabbed a knife, and for a short period, they went into an absolute frenzy, repeatedly stabbing Alice brutally until she was dead, and then turning their attention and stabbing Tibor twice in the heart. And so they had brutally killed these two in a total fit of rage. But the killer knew there were some loose ends inside of this apartment. And so very carefully, they slinked their way into the bedroom, and with that same knife they had just used to kill those two, they cut open the side of the mattress, and they crawled inside, and they waited. When Detective Finch first left the apartment, that first time he was there, and he's leaving to go speak to the hotel workers, when he opened the apartment door and he began to leave, he stopped because he noticed something weird. He didn't pursue it right then and there because he wanted to prioritize the interviews, but what he noticed was there's so much blood inside of this apartment. It's everywhere. The techs are telling me to be careful where I step so I don't track blood around. but he's looking down, like he's just opened the door to the apartment, and there's no blood leaving the apartment. All the blood is contained inside of the apartment. How is that possible? Well, the reason it was possible is because the killer never left the apartment. And so fast forward 2 days to August 12th, the same day that Detective Finch and his team came back to the apartment to do another sweep. So earlier that same day, the killer is still inside the mattress, but they know now they have to deal with Attila. And so very carefully, the killer slides out of the mattress they've masterfully been hiding in for the past 2 days undetected. And for reasons not fully understood, they ended up moving some things in the apartment, like that vodka bottle that was moved. And then also they went back inside the bedroom with Attila and they barricaded the door shut with something heavy. So they're barricaded inside the very room they've been hiding in. And now it's time to deal with Attila. And so the killer gets on the mattress, and they take their own clothes off, and they cut their wrists. Because it turns out the killer was Attila. They are the same person. And Attila was madly in love with his roommate, Tibor. And at that party, when he saw Tibor kissing Alice, he knew that his love was unrequited. And it threw him into a rage, and he stabbed and killed both of them. And then he sort of arranged Tibor, his love, in this sort of strange position, which probably was because he had such strong feelings for him. And then also when he attempted to take his own life 2 days later, when he staged his own death on the bed there, he sort of arranged himself in the same pose. But again, he didn't die. And so after Finch and his detectives broke into the room, they found Attila. They were able to get him to a hospital and treat him. And then once he was stable, he was arrested, found guilty of the murders, and sentenced to 26 years in prison. Late one night in 1870, a Harvard medical student named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. And with him was his classmate William, who was carrying an unlit lantern. Once they reached the gate, they both stopped and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and then they helped each other climb over the gate. And once they were on the other side, they took off running straight down the cemetery path. And eventually, after running for a minute, they got to the other side of the cemetery, and they came to a stop outside of a brick mausoleum that contained the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. So for years, James and William had been hearing all these rumors about this guy, Ephraim. In fact, many of their classmates had heard these rumors, and some people really believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had snuck in here to this mausoleum to once and for all prove that those rumors were false. According to the rumors, when Ephraim was alive, so 20 years earlier, he'd been this very reclusive chemist who lived in a big house in the middle of town, and he had this one servant. And anytime people walked past his house, apparently they would always smell this really pungent chemical scent. And people believed that what Ephraim was doing in there to produce that smell was basically trying to come up with a potion that would make him immortal. He was basically running these strange experiments. However, clearly his experiments had not worked, because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he died, his one servant had told the mortician not to embalm him, which was very unusual at the time. This was not a normal request. The servant had said that, even though Ephraim's elixir had not actually succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had been successful at making his physical body immortal. The servant said, apparently, Ephraim's body would never decay. And so this story had become sort of a local legend. And decades later, lots of people in the area, in particular in Harvard Medical School, students actually believed it might be true, or they at least pretended it could be true. It was fun to believe. But James, as much as he wanted to, go along with the story, logically he felt like there is simply no way there could be any truth to this story. As a medical student, he knew that even the very best embalming techniques would only preserve a dead body for a few weeks at most. So there was no way Ephraim's body, that had been dead now for 2 decades, was not a pile of bones by now. And tonight, they were going to go find out. James knelt down in front of the mausoleum where Ephraim was entombed. And William struck a match and lit the lantern he had brought with him. And immediately the light from the lantern, it illuminated the door that led into the mausoleum, and they saw it was sealed shut with a padlock. So James, who's knelt down right next to the door, he pulled out a small hammer and a chisel, and he began to work on this lock. And eventually, he popped it open, he took the lock and put it on the ground, and then he stood up, and he and William were like, all right, here we go. And they pushed the door, and it slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, with William right behind him, holding up the lantern. And the space was cold and musty, and it was this kind of claustrophobic, all brick space that was covered in cobwebs. And on each side of the inside of this mausoleum were these big shelves with caskets sitting on each shelf. These were all different relatives of Ephraim's, and there were nameplates attached to each of these caskets. And so very quickly, James and William, they began looking, for the right casket that contained Ephraim. And eventually they found the right one, and they're sort of nervous at this point, but they're like, all right. And they got to either side of this casket, and together they pulled it off the shelf and put it down on the floor. And so James and William, they both went to the same side of the casket, and William, he's holding up his lantern, and they look at each other, they're like, all right, here we go. And James reaches down, and he opens up the casket. And when they see what's inside, I can't believe it. Inside of this casket was definitely Ephraim's dead body. But even though Ephraim's clothing had clearly decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself did not look like he had been dead for 20 years. His skin was white and smooth, and there were no signs of decomposition on his body whatsoever. He was pristine. In fact, he looked like he was just sleeping, like he could just open his eyes and he'd be just fine. And so James and William are so spooked by this that they just instantly slam shut the casket, they turn, and they sprint out of the mausoleum, they flee the cemetery, and they pledge to never talk about this again. However, for the next few months, James just could not get the image of Ephraim's impossibly well-preserved body out of his head. Now, he still didn't believe the rumors that somehow, it's because of some potion that Ephraim drank that's made his body, immortal or something. But he read every chemistry book in the Harvard Library and could not find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. At the same time, James had another stress, which was he knew the Mrballen police were investigating the break-in at the mausoleum, and he was terrified that at some point, he and William were going to be found out. Desecrating a grave was a crime, and if James was actually arrested for it, he would get kicked out of medical school. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and no police showed up at his door. So nobody figured out that he or William were involved in this break-in. And also, over this time, over these many years, he never figured out what actually had caused Ephraim's body to be that well preserved. But eventually, they just moved on with their lives. James graduated, he became a doctor, and he really just sort of forgot about the Ephraim thing. He just moved on. Until 30 years later, in 1900. At that point, James was in his 50s, and he was a successful doctor with his own medical practice in Boston. And one day, he was sitting in his office, catching up on some paperwork, when he heard a knock at the door. And so he called for whoever was out there to come in, and when the door opened up, he was very surprised to see a police officer. The officer told James that he was from the Mrballen Police Department, and he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. Immediately, James felt sick to his stomach, and he was about to just start lying, saying he had nothing to do with it. But before he could say anything, the officer just said, look, multiple people in town have already told us that you and your friend William were responsible for that break-in. At this point, James knew he was caught, and there was no point in lying. Like, clearly, this officer knows what actually happened. And so James just rushed to explain sort of why they did it. He just said, look, like there were these rumors that the body of Ephraim Gray didn't decompose because he apparently drank some, immortality potion, and we thought it was crazy. So we broke in just to look at the body. We just opened the casket, looked at the body, we shut it, we ran out, that was it. But the officer, after hearing this story, just narrowed his eyes and stared at James like he didn't believe him. And then when the officer went on to explain exactly why now, 30 years later, they were taking another look at this break-in, when he explained that, James literally just could not believe what he was hearing. So it would turn out the Mrballen cemetery was in the process of being relocated, so workers were going through and moving every single grave. But when they got to Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. So they opened it up and found it was empty. There was no sign that anybody except for James and William had ever tampered with that mausoleum. And so basically, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. But they both swore they didn't do that. They said they just went in, they looked at the body, were shocked that it had not decomposed, and they ran out. They didn't take the body. But police, during their investigation, saw that nobody else tampered with this casket except for James and William. So where did the body go? It was almost like Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened up his coffin, and just walked out. And despite all of James and William's skepticism and all their medical training, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe somehow Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in. Gas, groceries, eating out, even on the tightest of budgets, there's really no escaping nor controlling them. But here's what you definitely can control: getting cash back every single time you fill up, you hit the grocery store, or go out to eat with the Upside app. One thing I really like about Upside is that it doesn't require me to change anything I'm already doing. So before I fill up, I just check the app to see what offers are available nearby. It only takes a few seconds. And getting cash back on gas I was already going to buy is always a nice bonus. Here's how it works. Open the Upside app, claim an offer, pay with your card like normal, and get paid. That's it. And yes, it's cash back, not points you'll never use, not credits that expire. It's real money you transfer straight to your bank account. Upside has given back $1 billion to its users. To find out how much you could earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code Mrballen to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code Mrballen. Available to US consumers only. On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, standing in front of a heavy locked door, were these two people, these two psychic mediums, who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. So the reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors, were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. There was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually, appendix removal was a routine surgery, and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But this operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Louise Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do this surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. So first, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room, so that backed locked room, while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists, nobody. And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him, they'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to, before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room. And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room, and then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready, and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked. And then the instructions had been given to, Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there, sort of listening and watching, and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph, and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor, but the whole thing was just sort of absurd. Honestly, Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was going to be this totally bizarre procedure done, he had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this, along the pew with him, talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to mention, the doctors are also saying that, generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help, was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he started to feel like, oh man, this whole thing's really unsettling. Now it's just creepy. The sound of the hymn and the mediums writhing around, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door. And it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually, this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert, at this point, looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we going to see in there? But they had waited this long, they really wanted to see, so they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're going to see what's inside of this, magical operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around. And at first, it was just really weird. There was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table. He has fresh stitches right on his side, suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid. The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here, to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this had happened. Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters, were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in during, before, after the surgery. Nobody came out, even though they swore, basically, that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so, this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost. At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California. And before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense, that somebody else was in the room with her. But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Gene. So Gene was 82 years old and he'd been really sick for the past couple of years. And recently, he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom so he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. But then in the mornings, he would often come and join her in bed. And so she's assuming that's what's going on. Gene must have joined me in the middle of the night and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Gene. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed, looking outward. And her perspective, from her head, the way she was positioned, is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like, these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Gene, because Gene did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know. And as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed and she looked at this guy and he leaned forward and he just kind of continued to smile and he said, "I'm here for Gene." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh. And then to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Gene burst in asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Gene all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes, and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Gene's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking, you were having a dream, clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances, the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Gene, she was starting to think that, maybe she had like a very lucid, vivid dream. However, just to be safe, Frances and Gene spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and also looking for, any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Gene did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing. But other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Gene, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened, and they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe. And so by 7 a.m. that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in a room with blue eyes, and this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Gene really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like 15, 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever. Gene starts falling apart, to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You gotta come here right now. Something's wrong with Gene. He's fallen apart here." By 8 a.m., when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after, Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know. But this is an hour later, the doctor shows up, and by this point, Gene is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed. He's falling apart. He gets rushed to the hospital, and all day that day, they're trying to save him. But by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Gene's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision, and so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Gene's death. However, despite telling herself this story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe. She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So how did her mind come up with this really vivid character? But she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience. Well, that is until a few months later. Late one night in the spring of 1958, so a few months after Gene's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Gene's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking, and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Gene's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much, she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes, who was looking right at her and grinning. And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it. And she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Gene, but on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. And so for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, what they thought it meant. And then at some point, towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, yeah, and then, right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Gene. And then, your dad died 24 hours later. And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet and she looks at her mom and she's like, that's not what he said to me. And Frances is like, what do you mean? What did he say to you? And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, he said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me. For a moment, the car just went totally quiet, and neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Gene. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Gene died. And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame that I know he said, I'm here for Gene, and you think he said, I'm here for Jane? But you're still alive, and that was months ago. You must have just misheard him. He must have said, I'm here for Gene, same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience, and in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Gene. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong. Because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year and 1 day after Gene died, Frances's daughter, Jane, died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up but had gone undetected, and now by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like, we gotta tell people about this, like what happened? And she even ended up writing to a journalist to try to get this story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker.